Welcome to week 10 of From Linear to Circular webinar series. And what a series it has been, what a journey it has been. And it's been an absolute pleasure, an absolute honor to be co-captaining this journey for you as we sail through various topics of circular economy. And I had a great fun of doing it together with my other co-captain, Seb.
Great to be here again, Ilma. I decided for the last week I couldn't take the humiliation, the jokes, the brutality that's been going on in that chat window for 9 straight weeks about my painted wall.
What
And so
color
I finally switched up locations. This isn't some huge renovation job that you're seeing that's happened in the past week. I'm in a different place. I'm just at the site of our big food workshop, which, by the way, you should all check out on YouTube if you missed it over the last few days. We'll mention that later.
Yes, it's some incredible content coming out from our food team, so it's definitely highly recommended. But today we're here for the last time to talk about the circular economy as part of this series, and we will be going into some big questions. We'll talk about the connections between circular economy and climate change, about how circular economy has been taken up on the global agenda, and what we can do to build back better now that we're coming out of COVID-19 crisis, or hopefully we're coming out of COVID-19 crisis. But before that, let's have a look at all 9 previous weeks and all the great topics that we have covered.
So in week 1, we started with the basics. We started with the principles, the core framework of the circular economy to bring us up to speed. And we talked about some of the misconceptions, this notion it's about designing out waste, not from waste. The idea that it's about keeping products and materials in their high value use, not just recycling on steroids, and this notion that we're looking at effective systems with inbuilt resilience versus efficiencies of scale, or more efficiency in regenerating natural systems.
And in week 2, we had our circular design guide lead, Joe Isles, and we talked about circular design, or why we can't unscramble the omelette, and why it all starts with design, and the fact that when we speak about design, and I completely lost my thought, and I think this is the first time it happens to me. Anyway, we talked about the concept of zooming in and zooming out, and why we don't only need to think about the product on the product level, but we also need to think about the system level and design both for the product and to fit the system.
Even a professional like you, Ilma, slips up once in a million hours of recording. So then we jumped into week 3 and we explored a few different business models related to the circular economy. And more than that, we kind of deeply interrogated, this is really about a business industrial transformation, and looked at some of the motivations for that with our networking lead, James George. I'd say that's a great one to watch back if you are in a business or communicating with businesses, because James drops real tips from his conversations with businesses.
And then in week 4, we met our former head of innovation, and I would say one of the key people in the world when it comes to circular economy and framing and concept of circular economy, and it was Ken Webster. And we talked about the sandwich and why we not only need to focus on the product level, but also think about the systems thinking and also the enabling conditions. And I think what really stood out for me from that session is that in order to have the effective systems, these systems need to be both efficient and resilient. And for resilience, it's the interconnectivity and diversity that we need to bring in and think about.
And Ken has probably forgotten more about circular economy than most of us know. So after having the dose of Ken Webster, we dived into 2 back-to-back weeks of multiple webinars. In week 5, it was the turn of plastics and policy. And we talked about really trying to have a more nuanced and applying that systems lens to a material flow like plastics, moving beyond overly simplistic narratives and looking at what a real innovation agenda with our plastics team looks like, and some of the work that is happening with our initiative there, New Plastics Economy. On the policy angle, we looked at policy through the lens of more than just legislation and regulation. What does it mean to create a vision, to drive roadmaps and bring together key stakeholders, and the important role that policy plays, a new role that policy plays perhaps in a circular economy.
And then week 6 brought us another 2 topical webinars, and we started with fashion, and we had our colleagues from Make Fashion Circular team, and we talked about the circular vision for fashion and why we need to create clothes that can be used more, that are made to be remade and that are made from renewable and safe inputs. And we also covered a couple of great initiatives coming from Make Fashion Circular team, which is Wear Next that happened in New York and Jeans Redesign that is happening right now. And then we talked about food and how especially food is interconnecting with the cities. And we talked about the circular vision for food, which is about sourcing regenerative and local produce where appropriate, about making sure that byproducts of food production feed back into the bioeconomy, and how we can design and market more healthy food choices.
Week 7 was one for the nerds, the people who love the data and asked the question, well, how do we measure all this? And we did a deep dive on the recently launched tool by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Circalytics, with members of the team behind that. Yeah, Circalytics, what a great tool. Looking at how do you measure circular economy at a company level and understand, and they're already able to share with us a few of the early results and findings from the various data things that they're running to produce results for different companies.
And we also mentioned why it is the most comprehensive, as we say, tool currently available. And then the week after, week 8, we had a great pleasure to have a guest speaker, our CEO, Andrew Morley, and we talked about where EMF, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is heading towards. And also we once again looked into the systems thinking and how that could be applied in one of our own initiatives covering, which is plastics, and Andrew shared his experiences putting this together. And we also talked about how to talk about circular economy with the highest level of speakers. And we had a great homework where you had to create your own circular economy pitches. And what I remember most from that is if you were able to explain circular economy to a 6-year-old, then you definitely have it nailed.
And then last week, of course, we had Hunter Lovins, author and founder of the Natural Capitalism Institute in the US. And wow, what a conversation we had with Hunter. We talked about how the renewable energy transition is happening already. It's happening in our lifetime. We talked about the power and potential of regenerative agriculture specifically and the very important role it plays. And we also reflected really on her experience of, I don't know what it was, like 40 years in activism, talking about these issues, researching these issues, and her hope, optimism, and just pure confidence that the changes that we have been talking about over the course of these 9 weeks are inevitable and are going to happen.
And it was great to hear some of these things reflected in your comments for this week's Monday question when we asked you about your key takeaways of the series. And what you were saying is that you really understood how the systems feature in the circular economy and what role the systems play in the transition to the circular economy, and the fact that we need to collaborate across the entire value chain, and that we need to start with design thinking, and design is a critical factor, especially upstream design. And we also need to feature regenerative agriculture and regenerative thinking, and government legislation plays a crucial role as well.
So how do we follow all that or cap all of that off? And there's no better person that I can welcome to help us to do that than the foundation's Josh Blair. I've been lucky enough to work with Josh since I started the foundation. Josh has worn a number of hats during his time here at the foundation, because he actually was one of the original members of the foundation. The foundation started in the Isle of Wight with a small group of people. He's currently our executive lead for governments and institutions work. So welcome, Josh. And Josh, I guess my first question to you is, in your work now, you and the foundation's work generally, we have a lot of conversations with people from the UN, from the EU Commission. We're going to talk about some of these macro sort of trending topics and conversations we're having during the course of the next 40 minutes or so. Did you imagine that would be possible when it was 3 of you talking about setting up the Ellen MacArthur Foundation 10 or 11 years ago?
Hey Seb, it's good to see you. Good to see you in the office. I feel honored to have been able to work with you for so long, and you haven't kicked me out yet, so it's great. I have this habit of becoming tangential after a few minutes of talking, but can I just do it right now, actually, because I feel the urge. And it's been prompted by comments in the chat box about Hunter Lovins, who is one of the most inspiring persons I ever met. And I had the chance when we did our summits in London of going out for drinks a couple of times with Hunter Lovins. She's incredibly entertaining and very wise as well. And I'll just put something here that she said to me and which resonated. It's whoever you have conversations with and whatever you want to influence, remember that sitting in the margins doesn't work. Because basically, if you don't have a seat on the table, it means that you're on the menu. So I'll leave you with that piece of wisdom, typical Hunter Lovins. But yeah, I guess we didn't imagine that, of course. It was actually four of us, Ellen, myself, Katie, who was Ellen's right-wing woman at the time, and Jamie, who ended up becoming our first CEO. And of course, meeting Ken changed a lot because we were dancing around an idea that we didn't really know what to do with until Ken really wrapped it up in a very nice framework and the circular economy, bringing all these strands and schools of thoughts together in one integrated solutions-oriented framework. But you have to remember that Ellen was part of that setup, and Ellen doesn't think twice when it comes to big ambitions. And she's very infectious in that. So at some point she said, well, you know, actually what we want to do and what we're setting up to do is changing the global economy, as if it was a trip to the shop or something like that. But because it was Ellen, you don't really question it. So if she says jump, you just wonder in what direction, you don't say why. And yeah, and everything precipitated and everything went really quickly after a couple of years when we launched the first report, which was probably what put us on the map in the first place.
And indeed, I don't think we have talked enough about Ellen. And I guess if a person has managed to sail twice around the world, then you can definitely follow her to the end of the world and follow whatever vision she has. And if she believes in that.
Yeah, unless she's in the car, because she tends to get lost. At sea, it's fine, but not on land.
And yet we all have followed Ellen for 10 years now. And whenever she's in the room, everybody stops and listens, because when she speaks, she definitely has something to say. And so just in these last 10 years of you being in the foundation, how would you say that the circular economy as a concept has been taken up on the global agenda? What have you seen happen and change?
I think the concept really met a very conducive context. When we launched 2010, circular economy had been adopted by Chinese policymakers for 2 years already, but it didn't really exist in Europe. And that's when a lot of price volatility and resource scarcity effects kicked in, and a lot of the businesses were feeling that effect. And of course, Europe is a very poor continent when it comes to resources and space. So everybody was freaking out. It's very dependent on supplies from the outside as well. And to give you an example, in 2011, the average car manufacturer saw its materials bill rise by 50% almost overnight. And that is a really crazy situation to be in, because it basically wipes your revenue, because your added value is, as you know, not necessarily on the sale of vehicles, but what you can make in terms of efficiency gains. And all of these things have a massive knock-on effect. So it was, the circular economy resonated in that context, and also because it was part of a reflection around waste management. So there's a combination of two things: no resources and basically no space to bury the waste in Europe, and the desire to be a bit more efficient and be more responsible with that. So it was very downstream, end of pipe to begin with. And the whole conversation really evolved when Commissioner Potocnik for the European Environment Commission, for the Commission and DG Environment, put together a platform called the European Resource Efficiency Platform in 2012. We were invited to sit as experts on this platform because Ellen had delivered a very inspirational talk to the European Commission, and they wanted us in the room. And from something that started life as a resource efficiency group, was born the first circular economy package. By that time, in 2014, businesses had realized that it was a major way for them to secure their supplies, but also to create new revenue and to have a really valid and solid business proposition. So I guess the first to go back to your specific question, one of the really big things that was surprising is that business came out in force to defend the circular economy agenda when it was thought at some point in 2015 that it was going to be dropped by the European Commission, or at least put on a back burner. And everybody said, well, no, you can't do that because actually it's not an environmental proposition. It's core business. We've invested in it. We need visibility. We're asking you to commit to that path for the future of industry renewal in Europe. And that was a big turning point.
So that's been happening in Europe. But what about other countries? And when did the rest of the world, so to speak, join in the conversation?
This is still happening. I think there are there's a lot of activity in Asia, but as it was the case in Europe, it starts with a waste management problem, more so even in countries which don't necessarily have the right collection and sorting infrastructure. And this is why it's important to get it right in those countries, because if we make the same mistakes, then of course there's going to be a linear lock-in, because you don't invest in big infrastructure and change your mind 2 years later. It kind of puts you in a cycle. We have seen developments in South America. And I'm thinking of Chile at the moment specifically, which has committed to a national circular economy roadmap. We see a lot of other interests federated by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. There's a Latin American and Caribbean coalition of circular economy. We see quite a lot of activity in Africa as well at the moment. So let's see how this pans out. Unfortunately, COVID has had a detrimental effect. There was going to be a big circular economy day with African leaders and the European Commission and the World Resources Forum co-organized together with us, the foundation. Of course, that's not going to happen, but we're working on the specific content, looking at the circular opportunity for Africa. So stay tuned on that. I guess we could, there are other pockets of activity. The point being that at the moment, the big hubs are really Europe and China, notably having signed an MOU between the two entities in July 2018, which is very embryonic at the moment. But if we pick up on the weak signals that are contained in that MOU, it talks about product policy, it talks about potential standards, and that could really shift the market.
And I guess when we talk about the big hubs, just China and EU, two of the biggest markets globally, if not the two biggest markets globally. We talked a lot about in this series. You know me, I'm the sort of guy, I love a different design, a different business model, even some of the stuff that, it's like, how do we redesign the food system? When we talk about the two hubs, we're kind of talking about the two legislative policy initiatives, frameworks that are quite well established at a national and I guess multinational scale in the case of the EU. What's the, I've read some things about the circular economy package that was produced by the European Commission. I'm not familiar with any of the papers that have been published in China. What are the fundamental roles that those pieces play in this transition? Because obviously there's lots of other activities that happen, like business innovation, etc. But what's the role of something like the circular economy package, for example, in Europe?
Well, it gives a really clear sense of direction of what are the priority areas, and it puts the focus on the sectors, which is helpful, but mostly the important thing is, where are we going to apply the legislative efforts? Is it about better waste management, or is it about moving upstream and starting to talk about, if you don't want to have to deal with something bad on your market, you should prevent it from coming onto the market in the first place. Do we have the right materials to create a fully circular economy? Are the business models that we talk about and seem to be very happy to highlight, do they actually exist? You could argue that everybody talks about performance-based business models, etc., and it makes a lot of sense, but actually, have you tried to find one beyond mobility, beyond the obvious? No, actually they don't exist because they're not supported. So it's about these big ideas saying, if we're serious about this thing, we're going to have to create an EU-wide or any region actually, a materials backbone, knowing where the stuff is, what it is, how it can be repurposed, tracking it, taking advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. Basically, it's a way to say, we are anyway thinking about how to renew, to dynamize the industrial network and the industrial mesh of a specific territory. We're going to guide this either by business as usual principles, or we're going to guide it by circular economy principle. And this is what those big roadmaps do. They set a direction. And of course, then there needs to be some specific legislation on the back of it. But if we agree on the terms, and there's a really strong sense of we're going to challenge business as usual, that is the biggest thing that these pieces can do, because they really set yourself up for a couple of decades worth of innovation if they're played right.
Is it fair to say, Josh, that the foundation, looking through the lens of the circular economy, sometimes we're looking for different things in these roadmaps, in these policy announcements, than a traditional sustainability, efficiency focused agenda? You know, I guess I've seen that people might critique them for not going far enough in certain areas, when actually they've made quite a big step in terms of talking about more upstream initiatives that maybe get unnoticed by advocates of a more traditional framework.
Yeah, and it's fair, and I think they should be, of course, celebrated for their ambition, but by the same token, everybody's in the same boat. We should all be pushing for more ambition. It is urgent. There are opportunities to capture out there, and things are moving. And in a way, I might be anticipating a question here, but the system reset that was very relevant before the COVID crisis, the call and the drive towards system change is even more relevant now. So this is why it is important to raise a level of ambition, but it's also important to be constructive and to say, okay, we can co-create around this. How can we make it even better? And how can we make the connections between things that might not be completely obvious in the first place? Yes, actually, a business model, when it's designed well, is conducive to climate change mitigation, which might not seem totally intuitive. But if you give access to multiple users to the same asset, then you multiply the utility rate and you displace the need for new assets. So the multiplication of vehicles is a good example in that sense. And if you mutualize the asset, then you don't need to have as many virgin raw materials coming on the market, which means that you reduce the impact of extraction, which means you have an impact on climate change mitigation. And all of these things need to be linked together. And what we've become pretty good at is, and under the leadership of Ken Webster, of course, is to look at the interconnectedness in all things. And when you can make those links, it really is a revelation for a lot of people, including groups that were not necessarily talking to each other. You know, climate was the territory of energy, renewable energy and energy efficiency alone. Now, if we look at the impacts of what we produce and how we use the stuff, including food, in our current economy, we see that if we don't make a dent in sustainable consumption and production, SDG 12, we'll never get anywhere. Energy alone is a big part of the story, but it's not the only part. And this is why it's also important when things like the UN Environmental Assembly, when some of these resolutions are voted, to say sustainable consumption and production, SDG 12, that is the circular economy. It should be referenced as an official solution framework, which was the case at UNEF4, and it was adopted. Therefore, countries who might not have circular economy on their radar feel empowered to start talking about it because it's a UN resolution. And all of these things gradually combine and create convergence towards tipping points.
So we will go deeper into the climate change links and also COVID-19. But before that, a couple of questions coming from the audience. Do you have anything to say about any signals we see in Africa and also Southeast Asia, or where to look for these signals, or let's say clusters of activities there?
Not yet for Africa. I think we're really starting this, and it's a shame because we would be actually 1 week away from the event, and we would have had a lot of discussion with partners. I know the African Circular Economy Network and the coalitions, they're working really hard. I think our friends and partners at Chatham House have done quite a bit of work on that, and we should probably share a couple of links. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, really the focus has been extremely strong on plastics. and what to do with plastics leakage, what to do with the absence of infrastructure, because there's a recognition that actually, given the rate of production, simple cleanups and downstream measures are just not going to cut it.
Okay, thank you for that. And so moving on to the climate change, and this is like this bigger crisis looming in the background for the time being while we're too preoccupied with building back better after COVID-19. And as you rightly said, so often when we speak about climate change and how we can mitigate the carbon emissions, we normally think about the reduction of or increasing energy efficiency, and it's all about the energy transition. While our research that we published last year shows that it's actually just 55% of reductions that could be achieved by moving to a more efficient energy system. And the remaining 45 is about circular economy and doing things in a more circular way. So could you elaborate a little bit more of that and explain that number of 45%?
Yes, all got to do with the way the industrial model of extraction, production, and distribution of goods, and to a certain extent services, but mostly goods and food. You know, we have a throughput-based value generation mechanism, which is you sell more stuff, you derive more revenue, basically, which means that the system is precluded on a replacement rate of assets in the market, which is quite high, or should be quite high, in order to service the all the financial arrangements, etc. Which means that actually extraction, which represents for an average, let's say an average white good that gets put on the market, 70% of its energy impact is at extraction and production of raw materials phase. I'm not even talking about actually putting that fridge together. It's getting the materials out of the ground and getting them ready to start building that thing. That's 70% of the impact, which means that if we look at extending the life of the product, extending its durability, designing for repairability, upgrade, etc., displaces the need for whole product replacement. And therefore, you can eat into that rucksack of externalities quite significantly by adopting those methods. And it's not only processes, and it's not only the factories, it's also the way that we make those things accessible. You know, a building that sits empty most of the time, even during office hours, could be repurposed for another activity. You don't need to create yet another building block. You need to look at, if we put a steam beam in a building, knowing that this building is only going to be in its current form for about 10 years. Now, by making sure that you know where that steel beam is, because it's digitally enabled, you know where your stuff is, and you know you've built the actual tower block of offices or whatever it is, with the deconstruction as opposed to destruction in mind, you can get your hand on this. So the feedstocks that you have in the economy in a dynamic way, you keep, and you know you don't have to go back and extract more. And all of these things are actually quite powerful when it comes to the dent that you can make in that rucksack of externalities.
I think that point you make about, well, how does the economy actually work is really one of the key takeaways from this whole program, in my view. And the point is that so often we're tackling things that don't really deal with that problem. That effectively value is generated, you say, by selling things. And therefore, in order to sell things, you have to do what you've just described, take something out of the ground, make something out of it, and obviously eventually it becomes waste. And there's a host of energy and labor implications in there. And, you know, and I guess your climate example, often when we think of, say, emissions from a car, we think about the exhaust fumes. We don't think about what goes into making that car, which is obviously very energy intensive. My question to you, Joss, is kind of how is a little bit around the kind of reception to this or of this. You mentioned the kind of work with UNEA4. The UNEA4 is the United Nations Environmental Assembly.
Yeah, it's the fourth Environmental Assembly. I mean, it's a bit complex, but there's an annual meeting, and a lot of things are discussed. And if I'll give you an example, actually, UNEA 3, the third one, was where the whole plastics conversation started to happen. So Norway put a resolution on the table saying we really have to do something about that marine plastic pollution. I don't really know what it is, but it's a massive problem. Does everybody agree? Yes, everybody agrees. and then realizing that actually cleaning up won't work, so you move upstream and you have that conversation. You say, actually, we identify the problem, now we need to move into solution space. And the same thing happened for the climate debate. You know, circular economy solutions were not really on the table. They started to be on the horizon last year at COP25. We're working really hard with the UN to make sure that there's a dedicated session to circular economy at COP26, really making sure that people have the whole variety of solutions at hand and we're not overlooking anything. You know, it's natural to be a bit siloed, because when you're focused on climate and energy, you only see climate and energy, and you only see, as you say, emissions, and you only see that kind of stuff. But if somebody comes and says, I have something that actually will help your cause, make you move along faster, and actually it makes potentially the whole challenge a bit less daunting. If everybody brings a bit of the solution, it doesn't feel like it weighs on one sector, on one group alone to solve for everyone.
And so yeah, so it's continuing to be, so the UN, there's a big coming together of international governments and people, important people in the world of countries and policy.
Most countries.
Yeah, most countries. And the point is, I guess, that's kind of as you've just outlined, a bridgeway for it being talked about in terms of how do we actually meet our carbon emission targets, which is, I guess, what the COP, for anyone who's not familiar with COP25s and COP26, maybe people don't watch the sort of news on climate. Those are the places where those are the annual events where, again, international meetups, I guess, to talk about, well, what do we need to do to make this happen?
Yeah, sorry, I tend to be
you're very in this space, Joss, and yes. Obviously I know all of this clearly, but I'm just for the ignorant people to educate them.
Yeah, not only am I in it, but I really love it. So I get a bit excited and I forget to be a bit more. I forget to unpack some of this stuff sometimes. So thanks for reminding me. COP is a conference of parties on climate change. So it brings all the countries together to discuss the big solutions, to agree on the commitments that every country can make. And to give you an example, at each COP, countries are supposed to make clear and time-bound contributions. They are called nationally determined contributions to the solution. So if you're a country, you say, this is my pledge, I'll cut this and this, and by 2050, I'll be at that kind of either net zero or something like that. But at the moment, all these nationally determined contributions, none of them, to the best of my knowledge, actually include circular economy. So they're missing out on one big part of the solution, which means that they can be as good as they want and as ambitious as they sound. It doesn't tackle the whole thing. Therefore, it doesn't really get us to where we want. It gets us partly to where we want. But if we identify that we called it the completing the picture, our report, to say we need to consider the whole system, and this is what we can bring, and this is what businesses can do, and this is what sort of enabling conditions policymakers can put in place in order for these solutions to flourish at scale. So this is what these processes, which have, I mean, these guys are terrible with acronyms and all sorts of jargon, but the point is, these are the big moments where you can make a mark on the discussion, take a fork in the road and put yet another solution on the table. Things are evolving, you know, there is innovation. It's a very fluid and organic process as well. And yes, there is urgency, but you don't necessarily have to be an expert on energy systems in order to have a valid contribution to make. And that's the stance we're making. We're coming at it from a humble perspective. We're not climate experts, we're not climate scientists, but we've identified that there is a big part of the problem that we can actually help solve. And we're putting the energy into that.
And it seems that situation in the world today gives us another chance to bring the circular economy on the agenda. And we demonstrated that with a joint statement from a lot of various global leaders that was published in Financial Times over the last weekend, committing to build back better and to step up rather than step back as we're coming out of COVID-19 crisis. And what COVID-19 has shown us is that the current supply chain system that we have in place, which is usually very efficient and delivers everything that we need very fast and exactly when we want it and where we want it. But when something like the global pandemic hit, it just revealed its brittleness. And circular economy could be one of the ways to increase its resilience. So how could we use the circular economy framework to build back better coming out of this crisis?
Yeah, you're right. It's exactly that. It's highlighting the brittleness of the system, shows that when it works, it works brilliantly, but it's pretty scary when something small makes it derail, because it goes out of the window pretty quickly with massive consequences. If you think about looking at circular economy solutions in peri-urban agriculture, for instance, which could have been a really good way of mitigating the negative impacts of hastily implemented lockdowns at city level, you know, the shortages, etc. But also people want to know where their food comes from, how it is produced, what does it mean in terms of ecosystem impact. And actually, yet again, regenerative agriculture means carbon sequestration in the soil, which is again conducive to climate change mitigation. The brittleness of supply chains mean that in the case of medical equipment, some countries have run out of spare parts for ventilators. And we see the innovation kick in, and guys in a shed somewhere with a 3D printer being able to really make those parts available. And then you hit yet another obstacle, which is completely linear, which is those machines have not been designed to be repaired in the first place. So even if you had the spare parts, it's not designed like that. And there was a movement really interesting in the US. A few congressmen have put pressure on ventilation machine manufacturers to release the open source manuals for repair, because actually a lot of these things were unusable simply because nobody knew how to fix them. And if only you make those things accessible and you have this design for remanufacture, design for reuse, design for durability, and you don't think your product is one proprietary element that you derive revenue from, but actually you say, what component in that machine can be used in another industry? How can you design an industrial tool, factories that can be repurposed and agile? So we've seen in the UK, the automotive industry starting to build ventilators quite quickly. That's one example, but what if you apply that logic post-pandemic to all the sectors and say, actually, you have a much more dynamic and adaptive industry, regardless of whether there's a crisis or not. You can move from making something to making a different thing, bearing in mind, you know, what's in your product. There's a transparency along the value chain, so you don't have any toxic materials to deal with. And some of the components have been standardized, and you can use part of, let's say, a smartphone into a photocopier next time. All these incarnations, that's the second principle of the circular economy, keeping products and materials in use, right? And yes, I see stuff popping up on the chat, which is at the same time distracting and quite entertaining. But yes, the right to repair movement is absolutely fundamental in this. And it's actually, to go back to your question, Seb, interesting to see that it's one of the opening lines of the European Circular Economy Action Plan. I was myself surprised to see right to repair being so prominently featured, because that's exactly what it is. If you don't repair it, like the farmers in the US have a problem with their tractors that they have paid a fortune for, so they're in debt for that material. The capex is massive for a tractor, big tractor, and then they can't actually fix them. So, which means that you can't really mutualize those assets. And when you think that a tractor, which sometimes is worth $500,000, it first sits idle a lot of the time. You can't really share it. You can't really mutualize it because there's software licenses. It's become increasingly complex. So rather than using the power of the fourth industrial revolution to lock users in, why can't we free innovation and make sure we keep track of the stuff that's in use and we make better use of it?
And I guess that's what I was getting at with my question earlier, Joss, as well, in the sense that, you know, like people might look at that package and take a look specifically at, I don't know, recycling rate targets, for example. And of course, it's, as you said rightly, it's important to challenge and be ambitious. But the mindset shift of saying, we're not just focusing on how do we recycle more, and that's almost, it's still almost in the kind of efficiencies of scale agenda. Like, how do we actually fundamentally enable a different kind of economic activity, right to repairs, on the front page of our action plan?
Yes, and from there, you can go a level deeper and say, what does it say about the values that underpin the economy? If you decentralize, if you give people access to those products, well, first of all, they feel included, and you can take part in the hacker labs and the maker spaces and the repair cafes. All of that is very gratifying when you take part in it, because you contribute to the economy. The economy is not something that happens somewhere else and that happens to you. It happens with you because you make it happen. The economy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a transcendent concept. It's the stuff that we make. And when you distribute it, that's what sometimes we talk about distributed and inclusive regenerative economies, giving people access to that, making them own the economic system as well. And the IT revolution does that, when now you can be your own self-employed entrepreneur, designer, and you don't need to invest in a factory. The capex, I mean, the capital expenditure requirements are very low. In many cases, people can start their businesses, things that they couldn't have done just 10 years ago. So it's all about, you know, what does it say about the relationship between the economy and society? Because actually, we've been accustomed to the fact that most people think they're completely disjointed, and there's some sort of economic system there that dictates the rules of society, which is actually not a fatality. We can change that.
And what for me really stands out is that in what you just described, that it's also about bringing people together in these small local clusters and providing them with the ways, as you say, to contribute to the local economy and feel that they're actually part of that. Or we had this internal joke in the team today that the IKEA effect, that we are so happy about things that we assemble ourselves or things that we are able to repair ourselves. And then the emotional value increases of these things as well. And then we don't want to just throw them away, but we actually want to keep them. And therefore we prolong the use of them in that sense. So it's interesting to see how it all comes together. And what about the biological side of it and the food? Maybe you could say a few words about the food system post-COVID-19.
Yes, so we've seen that the brittleness of the supply chain is one thing, but also because psychologically food is very close to people's preoccupations from a health perspective. And of course, we've been in a health crisis, so a lot of studies have shown that people were much more sensitive to knowing where the food that they ate came from, being more sensitive to the impact it has on biodiversity, etc. as well. And the whole idea is to say, well, there is an element of the food system that we intuitively know isn't right. It's too industrial. It relies on fossil fuels. The outputs are of questionable quality in a lot of cases. And in a way, we're extracting so much due to the agricultural system, we're depleting soil quality, et cetera, that it can't go like that in the long run. It's been acknowledged by many circular economy roadmaps and policies that actually the agricultural system should take its cues from regeneration, the third principle of the circular economy, you know, build natural capital, regenerate natural systems, but also look at the potential there is for new innovative materials that are safe for the biosphere if we capture the potential of organic waste, which, as the European Environmental Agency just pointed out today in a new report, is done in a very haphazard and archaic way in most cases. Waste is contaminated, and we basically overlook the value of bio-waste, organic waste, simply because we don't pay attention to separation and collection enough. And that really is about looking at how we should reconnect and close those nutrient loops. So make sure that what gets consumed in cities, for instance, goes back to the field where it should add value. And the current situation, if I'm a bit simplistic, is food gets consumed, the organic waste doesn't leave the cities where it should and go back to where it should. It gets either incinerated or landfill at high energy costs with environmental impact. And to complement the gap and the lack of nutrients going back to the soil, we put more artificial fertilizer, therefore depleting soil productivity even more, and that's a vicious circle. So the whole bio-food agenda is extremely important, yes.
We haven't got much longer left with you, Joss. This time always goes very quickly. I wonder, for our audience, Ilma referenced the kind of joint statement that was published in the Financial Times here in the UK this weekend. What are the signals that you're currently reading in terms of people's fears that this agenda might be dropped post this crisis, even as you make the case now that actually it's perhaps more relevant than ever? Are there reasons to be hopeful that it's even more firmly on the agenda than it was pre the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, and it also is. It's again about making those connections, and when you see that, because the pandemic has highlighted the fragility of our societies, a lot of people have started to realize that actually the climate change threat is in a way bigger and won't go away. So therefore, investors are asked to really consider the exposure of the companies they want to invest in to a variety of risks, and COVID, climate change, all of these things are now in a sort of almost intuitive bundle of things that could really hit us the hard way. So the call for resilience, I think, is unanimously heard, and people want to make sure that they take that into account. Whether it's addressed by circular economy alone or other strategies, of course, is a different question. But let's say that the current climate is very conducive to a system reset. And not all of it is going to be circular economy. Some parts of the circular economy can answer most pressing questions, but it's not a blanket solution. We have to also be inclusive and humble in our approach. But the fact is that seeing most governments and a lot of businesses come out in force, unprompted, saying the recovery needs to be green, circular, regenerative, is a very encouraging signal. And the Commission President herself has even gone to a level of granularity of saying 3D printing is part of the solution. You know, these things, it shows that people really do understand. There is not to say we can't be naive, the battle is not won, and there is a lot of work to be done still, but the signals that we've seen so far make me want to go back out there and do my job, because there's a lot to do. And I think, yeah, there's reasons to be optimistic.
So to close the conversation in the same place where we started, remembering where you were 10 years ago and the first team at EMF with 4 people, what would you say this team would say now, given everything that's happening with the circular economy and the global agenda? What would their reactions be?
Wow. God, I don't know. Yeah, when do we start again? I think you can't really, it really is difficult to be in that mindset, because in a way, we've forgotten how it was not to have that idea out there on the agenda. It's almost, I can't even go back to that mindset of there's a whole world to sensitize to that idea, just because 10 years have passed and now it's out there. I guess the old me would say to the current me, make sure that you don't rest on your laurels, because there's a lot of stuff to be done still. And yes, we might have been, we might see a tipping point coming, but the really hard work starts now. It's about scale. The awareness and the proof of concept, that is pretty much done. Now we could really miss the boat if we didn't pursue and make sure that it happens at fundamental system level. The last thing we want is a business as usual system with a couple of circular economy elements sprinkled on it.
So any final comments given our audience and the fact that we're closing the 10-week webinar series and they all have been very inspired by circular economy?
Well, they have to make it happen now.
I was going to ask Josh one question. That one of the things that struck me recently was the kind of news that the UK has been running heavily on renewable energy for the last couple of months. And actually that hasn't really been in the news. And one of the things I was reflecting on with some of the things you've been sharing with us is that sometimes it feels like with this topic in particular, and maybe a lot of topics, progress isn't necessarily going to be front page of whatever world news channel you're following. And sometimes you can sort of, and maybe when you're, it sort of struck me as you're reflecting back on the last 10 years, that scaling of circular economy as an idea that no one really had heard of or engaged with, to everyone's talking about it, and now it's kind of like we're almost working to frame it in a positive, effective direction that can have all the benefits we believe it can have. These, you know, that there's something quite subtle about these very profound shifts, that sort of strange dynamic that plays out.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that the bad news always, well, you know, it's a human tendency, and I don't know where it comes from, but there's we like bad news in a way, we like catastrophe. There's something twisted about this, and good news don't have the same impact, whereas actually they should. You know, who knows, for instance, that the European forests are much more healthy than they were 25 years ago. You know, between 95 and now, an area the size equivalent of Portugal has been added in forests in Europe. And yet, if we intuitively ask somebody what's the state of forests, it's like, oh, they're disappearing at this and that rate. And yes, it's true in some parts of the world. And yes, it's true that the way we've reforested in Europe might not be totally fine with regards to biodiversity. It's very uniform, but still, you know, the first thing to say is actually things can be improved. Not everything is irreversible. We can, when we put our minds to it, change the course of events which were created by design. And that's what we need to do. We need to design the next steps and be fully committed to changing the fundamentals of this system, because again, it's not a transcendence. They don't happen in a vacuum. We're responsible for the system we create.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, for joining us and for sharing some of those stories and perspectives on this kind of macro picture of circular economy. Appreciate you making the time. And thank you obviously everyone for sending in their questions and comments. This is the last webinar in a 10-week series. Feels like just yesterday that we were sort of launching this from our living rooms and talking about what we were going to do, and now we've been through it. One of the first things we did when we opened that first webinar was asked you to rate your knowledge of the circular economy via Zoom's really cool polling feature. And I'm going to launch that poll once again, and I want you to rate yourselves honestly on that scale. And hopefully the people who are ones are at least a 2, and so on. So please interact and engage with us. And whilst they're doing that, Ilma, I guess it's good to know, what are you taking away from this series?
Yes, and just to say that we still have a few things to say and a few announcements to make as we close the webinar series, including sharing some links and what may and will happen next. Yeah, it's, as I said at the very beginning of this webinar, it has been an incredible experience to be co-hosting the entire series, and so many great conversations. And I think one thing that definitely has stuck with me is the audience and the interaction with the audience and our 2 social Zooms that we had, and actually seeing and meeting the people that are behind the screen that we normally don't see. We just see the comments and questions from you guys. And it's been incredible to see the appetite, the enthusiasm, and also the work that you all are already doing in this area, and how committed you are to continue spreading the word on the circular economy and bringing the concept into your line of work. Another thing is that I wanted to say is that throughout the series, we have received a lot of questions and a lot of great and critical questions. And on one hand, I want to encourage you to continue asking these big and important questions, but at the same time, it's also about going and doing things. So yes, we need to think about things like how circular economy relates to social issues, how circular economy could be applied in different geographies. But at the same time, we have you in all corners of the world who can continue exploring these questions and find new solutions to make it happen. So ask critical questions, but also make sure that you ask them in order to improve, then you actually go and do it. What about you, Seb?
I mean, I would firstly, good reflections. I would echo a couple of things to build on a couple of things Joss was sort of finishing off saying there, in the sense that, you know, we're slightly wired towards negativity in some way, at least in our kind of macro interpretations of the world around us. It's kind of a scientific psychological fact, I think, that bad experiences scar us more than good experiences build us. But it's really valuable to acknowledge the system that we've created. We do have an influence on it. And what I've been inspired by in looking at everyone's reflections and sharings and responses and the questions that people have been asking in the various formats and mechanisms by which people have engaged through this program, that most of the people, indeed just about everyone in this program, has that potential to have some kind of impact and to engage in the co-design of the system around them. And that's really powerful. And hopefully the content of this program has given some of the context or concept to inspire your thinking as you go and do that, or at least that's my hope. Obviously that's a journey. And then just to echo what you've been saying, Ilma, and indeed in the feedback that I've received from people who have connected with me, that there's so much power in having this group and having the opportunity to meet people with a similar mindset or a similar mission, for lack of a better word. So I'm very grateful myself to everyone who's kind of engaged and driven that forward. And you can see from the poll results that we have I can't actually, the only thing I should have done prior to this is actually look up the results from last time.
Yes,
but,
so it's really
since we didn't do that, but what I'm 100% sure about is that we have a very strong, at least we've given you the perception that you have a much stronger knowledge of circular economy. And maybe the one comment on this poll, of course, is that this is a 1 to 5 scale of what you know today. And we're all learning and exploring this concept actively together all the time. So clearly there might be a 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 on this scale over the next 5 to 10 years.
Seb, can I just say, we can't see the results of the poll. Could you maybe read them out to us?
Oh, for God's sake, Colin. I've just shared the results.
Yes.
That was me learning how to use Zoom after about 30 webinars over the course of the
there are always room for improvement, Seb. And just a couple of more things that I wanted to add. So remembering Hunter Lovins, and I don't think we mentioned that, or she mentioned that in our webinar, but she mentioned this in the preparation call when we had with her. She said that find what you care about and live a life that shows it. And it really resonated with me, and combining it with what Ken said about that fact that effective system is an efficient and resilient system, and resilient systems need diversity, which for me shows that we all have a role to play, and we all can find a role to play in the circular economy. And it's about finding your niche and then bringing what you're good at, what you're passionate about, and weaving it in with 3 circular economy principles, thinking about how you can separate your thinking of biological flows and technical flows and making it happen. It's all about doing, and there's lots of work to be done.
And I guess before we just close with a few follow-on actions and things that people can do, I want to say a thank you to you, Ilma, as being a fantastic co-host for the program. but also that there's a huge team effort that goes into producing this series, besides all the different guest speakers, many of them from the foundation that we've had, and indeed the external speakers we've had as well. The team behind the scenes dealing with the questions, the people managing the community space, the people who have designed the program. Colin Webster just spoke there, essentially turned this program, someone was asking earlier, essentially turned it around in about 2 or 3 days when we realized that we were going to have to change up our activities. Anna Barnow, who obviously you've probably all seen active in the community, who runs the From Linda Circular program. It's a huge team effort, and thank you to all of those people who have been contributing throughout this throughout these 10 weeks. Yeah, and of course, thank you to you too, Ilma. You're all right.
I think you're right too, Seb, and I definitely second what you said about the entire team, and it has been an incredible effort throughout the last 10 and more so weeks. And I guess what I've really appreciated is how easy it's been to work together, and I think the ease of working is a really good quality to have within the team. And now I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we have a few final announcements, and it seems that we may overrun this webinar by 1 or 2 minutes. So yes, we ask you to go back to your learning trios and have one final call together to close and agree how you want to proceed, if you want to proceed. The Slack community will remain open until 31st of July. In the meanwhile, we want your feedback, so please fill our feedback form. It will close at the end of Sunday, this Sunday, and you can see the link to the form. I'm sure you'll have the link to the form in the chat. Someone will post it there, and we'll post it on Slack community as well. A few links we would like to share with you on our website: Learning Hub, Circular Design Guide, Circulytics, case studies, publications, and all that. And we also encourage, yes, Seb?
I was just going to say that we've done a few of these social Zooms. We get together, we have breakout rooms and get to know the community a bit. We haven't ruled out doing another one of those. There's an ongoing discussion, negotiation going on in the Slack channel. So that's possible. And also, obviously, there are many conversations, including that crop up in these Zoom calls we've been having about how do we keep the community open. Again, we're listening to all of that feedback. So do share that feedback in the feedback form and continue to put forward ways for us to do that in the Slack channels and various remaining meetups that we have, because it is possible for us to look at ways to keep this group connected beyond this program.
Yes, and one of the ways could be to join our existing LinkedIn communities, which you see on the screen right now, and we will share the links on the Slack as well. And besides that, it's really this. Thank you all for being part of this incredible cohort, and let's hope the circular conversations continue.